Good evening. Welcome to the second lesson of our series, Sex, Love, Marriage, and the Baby Carriage. A few years ago, a man named Glenn Wolfe died in Los Angeles at the age of 88 years old. Nobody came to claim his body. He had only $430 to his name, and that was applied to the cost of a pauper's funeral. And the city buried him and paid the rest. And the sad thing is that's a pretty common occurrence. People don't hear about it very often, especially in a large city like Los Angeles, but it happens a lot. And a lot of people die very alone and very broke. But Glenn Wolfe's case was pretty unique because he held a pretty remarkable world record. This is Glenn Wolfe behind me in the front of the screen. Glenn Wolfe was in the Guinness Book of World Records at that time for the most married man in history. He had been officially married 29 times. Now, understand that means 29 times Glenn Wolfe was asked, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, pledging yourself only unto her for as long as you both shall live? And 29 times he said, I do. But it didn't quite work out that way. His longest marriage lasted 7 years, and his shortest marriage lasted 19 days, and these are his 29 brides behind me. But did you hear the first part of the story? Even though he left behind 29 brides, several children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and of course a number of ex-in-laws, nobody came to claim his body. Nobody. How sad is that? I mean, you would think at least the divorce lawyer might have come. And as I read that story, I thought that pretty well illustrates the tragic circumstance of marriage in our culture and society today. Marriage is not easy. If it were easy, people would get married and stay married forever, but they don't. In increasing numbers, they bail out, jettison their marriage vows, or they just don't marry at all. They just live together in cohabitation. Now, I think one factor that helps people stay married when they are tempted to chuck it all is maturity. And if you were to ask me, what's the single thing that causes couples to work through their problems, like we're going to be talking about doing in this series, the single thing that allows them to do this is maturity. Now, maturity is not an easy word to define. The dictionary uses words like full development and completeness, but the best way probably to understand it is to say maturity means to be grown up. And that helps, especially if you have young children around the house, because all babies have this one thing in common. They are oblivious to anything except their own well-being. When they're hungry, they cry. When they're angry, they throw a fit. When they are tired, they go to sleep and nobody can stop them. When they want to be picked up, they just fuss and scream and cry until somebody obliges them. They see the world as a huge sphere which revolves completely around them. And they see mommy and daddy as two unpaid, full-time servants whose only purpose is to come whenever they are called. That's how babies come into the world. That's how babies are. But eventually things change over time. And they learn that the whole world doesn't revolve around them. And that great discovery is a part of what we call growing up, or slowly maturing. Now, here's the problem. Some people grow up physically, but they never grow up emotionally. Emotionally, they still see the world as if they were babies. And although they may be 30 or 40 or 50 or maybe even 60 or 70 years old, they are still oblivious to anything other than their own well-being. When things don't go their own way, they respond in some childlike way, such as crying or pouting or throwing a pity party or a temper tantrum. Now, what happens then when you put two babies together in a small room in an unsupervised fashion? Well, you're going to have problems pretty quick. They may play together for a little while, but pretty soon one will grab the rattle or the car away from the other, and then you're heading for World War III. And that, my friends, is exactly what happens in many marriages. Two grown-up babies get married. And for a while things are okay, for a while things are peaceful, but whenever an immature man marries an immature woman, the pot is sure to soon boil over. Emotional babies simply do not make for good marriage partners. They throw temper tantrums whenever they don't get their way. So what are some of the marks of immaturity in marriage? Let's think about this for just a moment. Well, first, there's an inability to receive criticism. They just don't want to hear criticism. Second, it's being slow to forgive and quick to blame. It's not my fault, it's your fault. Third is an inability to adapt to difficult circumstances. Fourth is a refusal to accept your own responsibilities. And the fifth is a desire to have your own needs met above anybody else. And maybe that fifth one really sort of sums them all up. The grown-up baby says, me first and you second. So what is maturity in marriage? It is the ability to grow through the predictable crises of married life. Everybody has trouble. If a couple says they never have problems, I have a hard time believing that. I assume that means they are living in different houses or maybe even on different continents. Here's why. Because the Bible says we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. All of us are sinned. And so a marriage is basically two sinners living together. And in that scenario, you're going to have some trouble sooner or later. There's no such thing as the perfect husband, and there's no such thing as the perfect wife, and there's no such thing as the perfect marriage. No such thing has ever existed. Every marriage is imperfect. Every wife is imperfect. Every husband is imperfect. The only question is, how do you react in the difficulties of living with an imperfect person? That's where the rubber meets the road. And so maturity is the ability to grow closer together through the trials of life that are inevitable. It's what keeps a couple still in love after traveling over an ocean of heartache. Now, in all the Bible, there is no better picture of mature love than the one Paul paints for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. In fact, couples often request that I read this passage in their wedding ceremonies. If you want to know how love is supposed to work, this is the chapter for you. Married couples would do well to read it together, memorize it together. They would do even better to put it into practice together every day. But for our purposes in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we are only going to concentrate on one verse. Because I think verse 7 contains 4 phrases that explain how mature love operates in the life of a Christian man or a Christian woman. This is love, down in the nitty-gritty. Now, I grew up on the old King James Version, so let's use it first. It reads there, bears all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. I preach mostly out of the NLT, so let's read it there. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. But I also like to study paraphrases. And so my favorite paraphrase here is the Living Bible, which says, if you love someone, you will be loyal to him no matter what the cost. You will always believe in him, always expect the best of him, and always stand your ground in defending him. For our purposes, let's use the King James Version. The first phrase in that verse says, love bears all things. So I had to look up what that word meant in the Greek because it wasn't familiar to me, bears. And it's from a Greek word meaning to cover something. And so the people in the first century, when they read it, would have known that word mostly as describing a covering of a roof. Love is like covering over a roof to keep the rain and the storms and the animals out. That's the way they literally would have understood it. To protect the home from the hostile elements. Wow. Love in marriage bears all things. It protects the home from any hostile element. And that jives right well with 1 Peter 4:8, which says, most important of all, continue to show deep love for each other, for love covers a multitude of sins. The two very important and relevant applications here. First, love doesn't nitpick. It doesn't point out every single flaw and failing of your mate, because you could do it. Any of us could. I remember one time in a small group here at church, we were discussing this very point about marriage, and one of the wives present said a very wise thing. She said, you can't talk everything out. Some things you just have to decide to not fight about and not worry about. And I just thought that was one of the most brilliant things about marriage I'd ever heard. You can't talk everything out. Some things you just have to decide not to fight about and not to worry about. She's right. Because if you took the time to point out every mistake that your husband or wife make, you wouldn't have time for anything else. Love doesn't nitpick. And it also doesn't criticize in public. And I think maybe that's Paul's primary meaning here. I mean, love doesn't do its dirty laundry for all the world to see. That's why I cringe whenever I hear a husband humiliating his wife in public, or a wife making snide remarks about her husband in public. Because I always think in my mind, if they do that in public, what do they do in private? As a friend of mine once told me, there are many times in my life when I have been sorry that I opened my mouth. But there has never been a time that I've been sorry when I stayed silent. Pretty good advice. When it comes to public criticism of your husband or your wife, it's excellent advice. The second phrase in verse 7 says, love believes all things. That simply means that love believes the best that is possible, as long as that can be done. Love gives the benefit of the doubt. It takes people at their highest and best, not at their lowest and worst. And that's very, very hard to do in this cynical age in which we're living, because we're used to cynicism, we're used to sarcasm, we're used to being so ripped off that we almost expect it. We're used to having our leaders lie to us and fail us. We have become so jaded that we doubt the goodness of our fellow man. Let a man do something generous for his country or his church or his friends or his company or his community or his family, and secretly other people will wonder, what's in it for him? What's he really trying to get? What's the end game? Now understand me. Paul is not calling here for naive gullibility. Wisdom and love go together. But love does not doubt when there's no reason to doubt. Love is not jealous when there is no reason to be jealous. Our legal system is predicated on the principle that all people are innocent until proven guilty. When an accused man or woman goes on trial, they are innocent in the beginning. And in our system, they don't have to prove their innocence. That is assumed. The state has to prove him guilty, and if they can, he goes free. That's what we mean by the presumption of innocence. And yet many times people in their homes, husbands and wives and families together, get a better deal from a mostly crooked government than they get at home. They get very little presumption of innocence. I never tire of repeating this simple truth. People often become what you believe them to be. They either live up or they live down to your expectations. Up or down to your expectations. If you take your kid, your son or daughter out to a Little League baseball game to play, if you keep drilling into their head all the way there, now take a good swing, keep your eye on the ball, you can hit that ball. They'll have a better chance of hitting that ball than if you ride them all the way out there going, you'll never hit that ball. You're not any good. This is not your sport. You shouldn't be doing it. If you treat your wife as if she is the most beautiful woman in the world, you will see her transform before your very eyes. Because people become what you believe them to be. That's what Jesus did all the time. To Simon, who was vacillating all the time, here, there, and everywhere, he said, "You are a rock." Simon eventually in the early church became a rock. To a prostitute, he said, "Your sins are forgiven." To a woman caught in adultery, he said, "Go and sin no more." It is the simple power of believing the best and not the worst about people. People become what you believe them to be, and it is never more true than it is in your own home, with your husband or your wife, or with your children. The third phrase in verse 7 is love hopes all things. Now I hope you notice there's a step process going on here, because this is a step, hope is a step beyond believing. This means something like this. There are times when you face situations in your life where faith is almost not possible. You would gladly give the benefit of the doubt, but there's none to give. You search for the silver lining, but the angry clouds above don't seem to have any break in them, and there is no silver lining. Some of you may be facing a situation like that right now because we're undergoing a crisis in our country with this pandemic. Or it may be one of your children, or it may be your husband or wife, and that's why you're watching these lessons. Or it may be your family, or it may be an illness, or it may be an impending financial disaster. It may be your job. Whatever it is, one word seems to apply in your mind, and you hear it over and over again all the time, and that is impossible. And you've cried and wept, and you've done everything you know to do, and nothing seems to work. Well, you've got to try this. You've got to try this next step up the scale. You've got to move from just believing to hope. That's a higher scale. What do you do when you don't believe anymore? You hope. That's a step beyond belief. And love always hopes. That's what this verse says. Love always hopes. If it can't hope in the present, it hopes in the future. And that's something that you can do. One final phrase in verse 7. Love endures all things. In the Greek, this is a military term for standing your ground in the midst of a fierce battle. It's used in the New Testament several times to describe enduring suffering and persecution. So with this phrase, verse 7 is coming to a logical climax. First, love covers the sins of those it loves. Second, love believes the best as long as that is absolutely possible. Love, third, hopes when it cannot hardly even believe. And fourth, love endures even when hope is gone. Did you get that? Did you get that step-by-step progression? Starts easy, ends hard. But love, true love, doesn't commit suicide. It doesn't give up and walk away. It just doesn't. True love doesn't mean that everything will always work out the way you like. In real life, love is often crushed. I have no doubt I'm speaking to somebody out there who has lost love and been crushed by it. Because loving someone is risky business. What if they abuse the love you freely give? You see, for the Christian, I think there's only one possible answer, and it's given in Tennyson's famous words. It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. The real losers in life are not those who have loved and lost and had their love rejected. They are those who never even tried, who refused to love at all. In his book, The Four Loves, C.S. Lewis spoke to this very point. Very, very powerful. And so I'll close with it. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all of the dangers of love is hell. That was true even of Jesus. So, my friends, it is the work of the Holy Spirit to pour out God's love into your heart. Let Him. And let that be a motivating factor in your marriage to push you on to mature love. God's kind of love. Now, the next 2 weeks in our series is going to be very, very practical. We're going to talk about the biggest cause of problems and even divorce in marriage, and that is communication. So be sure you join us for the next 2 lessons as we talk about communication in marriage. God bless you.